The rain came down in sheets that night, a relentless drumming against the warped shingles of the old house on Maple Street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and unspoken words. Ellen stood in the narrow hallway, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her dark hair clinging to her forehead from the humidity. She was 38 then, though the lines around her eyes told a story of years heavier than her age. Her voice, when it came, was steady but raw, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "Get out, Tom. Take the boys and go. I can't do this anymore." Tom stood there, his broad shoulders slumped, a duffel bag slung over one arm and a twin on each side. Jack and Milo, 6 years old, their identical faces pale and wide-eyed. The boys clung to his legs, their small hands fisting the fabric of his jeans. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just looked at her, his hazel eyes dulled by exhaustion, and nodded once. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice low, almost lost under the rain. "I'll make it right." Ellen didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat was a knot of grief and fury, and if she opened her mouth again, she'd either scream or sob, neither of which she could afford. She turned away, staring at the peeling wallpaper as Tom ushered the boys out into the storm. The door clicked shut behind them, and the silence that followed was louder than the thunder. She didn't cry that night. She scrubbed the kitchen counter instead, her hands trembling as she wiped away crumbs and coffee stains. The house felt too big without their noise, the clatter of toy cars, the endless bickering over who got the blue cup. But it also felt lighter, like she'd shed a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten how it bent her spine. Ellen had loved Tom once. 10 years ago, he'd been the man who'd made her laugh until her sides ached, who danced with her in the kitchen to a staticky radio. But love had eroded under the grind of life. His lost jobs, her double shifts at the diner, the bills that piled up like snowdrifts. And then there was the drinking. Not violent, not loud, just a quiet drowning that left her alone even when he was there. The twins deserved better. She deserved better. So she'd made her choice. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, weak and watery. Ellen stood at the window, coffee cooling in her hands, and watched the empty street. She didn't know where Tom had gone, his sister's place maybe, or some friend's couch. She didn't ask. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd done the right thing, even if no one would ever know the cost. 7 years passed like a slow bleed. Ellen stayed in that house, though it grew shabbier with each season. She worked at the diner still, her hands rough from years of scrubbing plates, her smile a practiced thing she wore for tips. The twins' room stayed locked, a museum of dust and memory. 2 small beds, a shelf of books she'd read to them until her voice gave out. She didn't date, she didn't dream. She just kept going, one foot in front of the other, because that's what you do when the world doesn't stop spinning. She thought of Tom sometimes, late at night when the house creaked and the loneliness pressed in. She wondered if he'd sobered up, if the boys still had his crooked smile, but she never looked for them. She'd closed that door and pride, or maybe fear, kept it shut. Until the day the helicopter landed. It was a Thursday, gray and ordinary, the kind of day that blends into the next. Ellen was wiping down tables, her apron streaked with ketchup, when the sound came, a low, rhythmic thrum that rattled the diner's windows. She stepped outside, squinting into the sky, and saw it, a sleek black machine descending onto the empty lot across the street, kicking up dust and gravel. The other waitresses crowded behind her, whispering, but Ellen just stood there, her heart thudding in a way she couldn't explain. The door slid open and 2 young men stepped out, tall, lean, with dark hair and hazel eyes that hit her like a punch. Jack and Milo. 13 now, their faces sharper, their shoulders broader, but unmistakably hers. And then Tom emerged, older, grayer, but standing straighter than she'd ever seen him. He wore a tailored coat, not the frayed jacket she remembered, and his gaze found hers across the distance. "Ellen," he said, his voice carrying over the dying whine of the blades, "we need to talk." She didn't move. She couldn't. The world tilted, and all she could think was that she'd kicked him out without looking back, and now, 7 years later, he'd returned with a truth she wasn't ready to face. The diner buzzed with curiosity, but Ellen barely heard it. She led them to a booth in the back, her hands shaking as she set down 3 cups of coffee she didn't remember pouring. The boys, her boys, sat across from her, their expressions guarded but soft. Tom slid in beside them, his presence both familiar and alien. "Where have you been?" she asked finally, her voice cracking on the last word. Tom rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble there flecked with silver. "Everywhere. Nowhere. Took me a while to climb out of the hole I was in, but I did it. For them." He nodded at the twins, who watched her with eyes too old for their years. "Why now?" she pressed, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Why come back?" "Because you deserve to know," he said, "and because they wanted you to." Jack spoke then, his voice deeper than she'd imagined. "We missed you, Mom. Every day." Milo nodded, quieter, his gaze dropping to the table. "Dad told us what happened, why you made him leave. We get it now." Ellen's chest ached, a sharp, sudden pain that stole her breath. She'd done it for them, kicked Tom out to protect them from his spiral, to give them a chance at something better. But she'd never thought they'd understand. She'd never thought they'd come back. Tom leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I hit bottom after you threw me out. Lost everything, but then I got clean. Got a job, construction, then management. Met a guy who took a chance on me, and things changed." "Big. Big how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then said, "I own a company now, small aviation firm. That chopper out there, it's mine." Ellen stared at him, then at the boys, then out the window at the helicopter gleaming in the dull light. It was too much, too sudden, too surreal. She'd spent 7 years building a wall around her heart, and now it was crumbling, brick by brick. "I didn't come to brag," Tom added quickly. "I came because you were right to do what you did, and I owe you everything for it." She didn't know what to say. The diner faded around her, the clatter of dishes and chatter of voices dissolving into a hum. All she could see were her sons, grown and whole in the man she'd once loved, remade by time and choices she'd never witnessed. And somewhere deep inside, a crack opened, a sliver of light she hadn't felt in years. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the chipped Formica table. Ellen sat frozen, her coffee untouched as the words hung between them. Tom's confession, the boys' quiet presence, the impossible reality of that helicopter outside. Her mind churned, a storm of questions she didn't know how to voice. 7 years. 7 years of silence, of scraping by, of convincing herself she'd made the right call. And now this. Jack shifted in his seat, his long fingers tapping the edge of his mug. "We wanted to find you sooner," he said, his voice steady but laced with something raw. "Dad said we had to wait, said you needed space." "Space," Ellen echoed, the word tasting bitter. She looked at Tom, her eyes narrowing. "You decided that for me?" Tom met her gaze, unflinching. "I didn't know what else to do, Elle. You shut me out, rightly so. I was a mess. I couldn't come back until I had something to show for it, until I could look you in the eye and not see shame staring back." Milo spoke up softer, his head still bowed. "He didn't want us to hate you. He told us you were strong, that you did it for us." Ellen's throat tightened. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, some version of it anyway. In her darkest hours, she'd pictured Tom crawling back, broken and begging. In her weaker ones, she'd dreamed of the boys running through the door, small again, calling her name. But this polished, poised man and these half-grown sons who spoke with a quiet dignity she hadn't taught them, it was a script she hadn't written. "I didn't do it to be strong," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I did it because I was drowning, because I couldn't watch you fall apart and keep them safe at the same time." Tom nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know. And I hated you for it, God, I did. But it woke me up. Took me years to see it, but it did." The diner door jingled as a customer left, and the sound snapped Ellen back to the present. She glanced around, Betty at the counter, pretending not to eavesdrop, the trucker in the corner nursing his pie. Her life, small and steady, suddenly felt like a stage invaded by strangers. She pushed her mug aside and leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. So what now, Tom? You fly in here, drop this on me, and what? You think I'll just, what, clap for you? No, he said, his voice low. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know they're okay. That I'm okay. That what you did, it wasn't for nothing. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a small worn photo. He slid it across the table and Ellen's breath caught. It was her, younger, smiling, holding two chubby toddlers on her lap. The edges were creased, the colors faded, but the memory was sharp. A summer day at the park, Tom behind the camera laughing as the boys smeared ice cream on her shirt. We kept it, Jack said. Dad said it was proof you loved us. Ellen's fingers hovered over the photo, then pulled back. She couldn't touch it, not yet. It was too much, a bridge to a past she'd buried under layers of survival. She looked at Milo, then Jack, searching their faces for the little boys she'd lost. They were there, in the curve of their mouths, the tilt of their heads, but they were also gone, replaced by these young men who'd lived a life she hadn't seen. Where do you live now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Seattle, Tom said. We've been there 5 years. Started the company 3 years ago, small at first, charter flights mostly. Then it grew. I don't know how exactly. Luck maybe, or stubbornness. Seattle, she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. She'd never left this town, never had the money or the reason, and now her sons were from somewhere else, shaped by a world she couldn't imagine. We go to a good school, Milo added, glancing up at her. Dad made sure, said you'd want that. Ellen's eyes stung and she blinked hard. She did want that. She'd wanted it so badly she'd worked herself to the bone, dreaming of a day when they'd have more than hand-me-downs and library books. But she hadn't been the one to give it to them. That truth cut deeper than she'd expected. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile, until Betty called from the counter. Ellen, you need a break? I can cover. Ellen shook her head, forcing a tight smile. I'm fine. She wasn't, but she needed the anchor of this place, the familiar weight of her apron, the rhythm of wiping tables. She stood, smoothing her hands over her hips, and looked at Tom. I need time, she said. It's a lot. He nodded, rising with the boys. We're here for a couple days, staying at the motel on Route 12. You can find us when you're ready. When I'm ready, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She watched them leave, the boys casting glances back at her, Tom's stride steady but slow, like he was giving her every chance to call him back. She didn't. That night, Ellen didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, the photo from Jack in her hands. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the rain had started again, a soft patter against the roof. She traced the faces in the picture, hers, theirs, and let the tears come. They weren't loud or dramatic, just a steady leak of everything she'd held in for 7 years. She'd kicked Tom out because it was right, because love wasn't enough when it came with chaos. But she hadn't known the cost. She hadn't known she'd lose them too, that the boys would grow up with a hole where she should have been, and now they were back, not to blame her, not to beg, but to show her what her choice had built. A sober father, a stable life, a future she'd wanted but couldn't give. The next morning, she called in sick to the diner. First time in years. She drove to the library, an old habit from when the boys were small, and sat in the parking lot watching mothers herd their kids inside. She didn't know why she was there, only that she needed to think, to feel the shape of this new reality. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. It was Jack. We're at the park by the river today if you want to see us. No pressure, no guilt, just an open door. Ellen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply. She didn't know what she wanted, not yet, but she started the car anyway, the engine sputtering to life, and turned toward the river. The park was quiet when she arrived, the grass damp from the night's rain. She saw them before they saw her, Tom on a bench, the boys tossing a frisbee near the water. Jack laughed as Milo missed a catch, and the sound hit her like a memory she'd forgotten she had. She stopped, her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, and watched. Tom noticed her first. He stood, hesitant, and waved her over. The boys turned, their faces lighting up, and something in her chest cracked wide open. She walked toward them, slow at first, then faster, until she was close enough to see the freckles on Milo's nose, the scar on Jack's chin from a fall she hadn't been there to bandage. "Hey," she said, her voice breaking. "Hey, Mom," Jack replied, and Milo smiled, a small, shy thing that felt like forgiveness. Tom hung back, giving them space, and Ellen realized then that he wasn't here to take anything from her. He was here to give something back. They sat by the river for hours, talking about nothing and everything. School, friends, the time Milo tried to fly a kite and got it stuck in a tree. The words came slow, then easier, a thread stitching across the years. And when the sun dipped low, painting the water gold, Ellen felt it, a shift, a softening, the first fragile roots of something new. The air by the river carried the sharp bite of early spring, a chill that seeped through Ellen's coat as she sat on the weathered picnic table. The boys flanked her, Jack on her left, Milo on her right, their shoulders brushing hers in a way that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Tom stayed a few paces away, leaning against a tree, his hands in his pockets, watching them with a quiet intensity. The frisbee lay forgotten in the grass, the afternoon stretching into something unplanned, unscripted. Ellen's hands rested on her knees, fingers flexing against the rough denim. She wanted to ask 1,000 things, about their lives, their dreams, the years she'd missed, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she listened as Jack told her about a science fair he'd won last year, his voice bright with pride. "Built a model plane," he said, grinning. "Not a real one like Dad's, but it flew. Well, mostly. Crashed into Mrs. Carter's roses, but she gave me a ribbon anyway." Milo snorted, nudging his brother. "She felt sorry for you. It was a mess." "Was not," Jack shot back, but there was no heat in it, just the easy rhythm of siblings who'd grown up side by side. Ellen watched them, her chest tight with a mix of joy and grief. They were whole, these boys. Funny, smart, alive in a way she'd prayed for but never seen. And she hadn't been there to shape it. "What about you, Milo?" she asked, turning to him. "What do you like?" He shrugged, his gaze drifting to the river. "Reading mostly, sci-fi stuff. Dad got me this old set of books, Asimov, Bradbury. I've read them all twice." "Twice?" She smiled, faint but real. "You always did love stories, used to make me read Goodnight Moon until I could recite it in my sleep." Milo's lips twitched, a ghost of a grin. "I remember, you'd do the voices." She nodded, the memory sharp. His small body curled against hers, Jack sprawled across the bed, the lamplight soft on their faces. It felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago. "I'd do 'em now if you asked," she said, half joking, but her voice cracked, betraying her. He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them. Silent, heavy, a bridge over the gap she'd thought was too wide to cross. Tom cleared his throat, stepping closer. "They're good kids, Elle, better than I deserved. I messed up a lot, but they kept me straight." Ellen glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't get to take all the credit, Tom. They're mine too." "I know," he said quickly, hands up like a surrender. "I didn't mean it like that, just they're proof you were right. About me, about everything." She didn't respond, not right away. The river rushed past, a steady murmur that filled the silence. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust this version of Tom, the one who'd climbed out of the pit she'd left him in. But 7 years was a long shadow, and forgiveness wasn't a switch she could flip. The boys sensed the shift, their chatter fading. Jack kicked at a pebble, sending it skittering toward the water. "We don't have to talk about it," he said, his tone careful. "The past, I mean. We just wanted to see you." Ellen's heart stuttered. "I wanted to see you too. Every day I did, I didn't know how." Milo reached out then, hesitant, and touched her hand. His fingers were warm, calloused in a way that spoke of growth she hadn't witnessed. "You do now," he said simply. She held his hand tight and felt the tears prick again. Not the quiet ones from last night, but something fiercer, born of relief and regret. She didn't let them fall, not yet. She had to be steady for them, like she'd always tried to be. The sun was sinking when they finally left the park. Tom offered to drive her home, but she shook her head. "I need the walk," she said, and he didn't push. The boys hugged her, awkward, brief, but real, and she memorized the feel of them, the way Jack's arms were strong, Milo's gentler. Tom lingered a moment longer, his eyes searching hers. "We'll be around tomorrow," he said. "If you want." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched them climb into a rental car, a sleek thing that matched the helicopter, another piece of the life he'd built. As they drove off, she started walking, the cold air biting her cheeks, the river's song fading behind her. The house was dark when she got back, the silence heavier than usual. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she went to the twins' room, the door creaking as she pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the faint glow from the street lamp outside, settling on the beds, the books, the toys frozen in time. She sank onto Jack's old mattress, the springs groaning under her weight, and let her hands rest on the faded quilt. She'd kept this room locked not because she wanted to forget, but because she couldn't bear to remember. Every night she'd walked past it, telling herself it was better this way, better for them, better for her. But now, with their voices still echoing in her ears, she wondered what she'd traded for that certainty. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out. Another text from Jack. "Thanks for today. Can we do it again?" Below it, a photo, her and the boys by the river, Tom's shadow just out of frame. She hadn't noticed him taking it. She stared at their faces, her own caught mid-laugh, and something loosened inside her. She typed back, "Yes, tomorrow." Then she set the phone down and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung, faint and stubborn. She didn't sleep, but she didn't cry either. She just breathed, letting the weight of 7 years settle into something she could carry. The next day dawned gray, the sky thick with clouds that promised rain. Ellen woke early, her body stiff from the narrow bed, and made coffee strong enough to jolt her awake. She didn't call the diner. Betty would understand or she wouldn't, and either way, Ellen didn't care. Today wasn't about routine. She met them at the motel, a squat building on the edge of town with peeling paint and a flickering sign. Tom opened the door, the boys behind him, and the room smelled of instant coffee and teenage sweat. It was small, cluttered with duffel bags and books, but it felt alive in a way her house hadn't in years. "Thought we'd go for breakfast," Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's a place down the road, pancakes, the works, if you're up for it." Ellen nodded and they piled into the car, the boys filling the back seat with chatter about a video game she didn't understand. At the diner, not hers, a different one, she watched them eat, Jack drowning his pancakes in syrup, Milo picking at his with a fork. Tom sat across from her, quiet, letting the boys lead. "You're different," she said to him when the twins stepped outside to check a text from a friend. He raised an eyebrow. "Good different or bad?" "Just different. Calmer maybe? Like you're not running from something anymore?" He leaned back, his hands wrapping around his mug. "Took a long time to stop running. Rehab helped. The boys helped more. Every time I wanted to quit, I'd look at them and think of you, how you'd never quit no matter what I put you through." She didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was close. She sipped her coffee, letting the warmth ground her, and watched the boys through the window, laughing at something on Jack's phone. "They're happy," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yeah," Tom replied, "they are." And for the first time in 7 years, Ellen let herself believe that might be enough. The diner's jukebox hummed a faint country tune, the kind Ellen used to sway to in the kitchen with Tom all those years ago. She sat across from him now, the remnants of breakfast scattered between them. Crumpled napkins, a half-eaten stack of pancakes, a smear of syrup Milo had left behind. The boys were outside, their laughter filtering through the glass as they tossed a crumpled paper ball back and forth. Ellen watched them, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, the warmth long gone. "You ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't kicked you out?" she asked, her voice low, almost lost under the music. Tom didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze fixed on the boys beyond the window. "Every day," he said finally. "Some nights it's all I think about. If I'd gotten my act together sooner, if I'd fought harder to stay." She nodded, not surprised. She'd asked herself the same question 1,000 times, lying awake in that empty house, wondering if she'd been too hard, too quick to cut the cord. But the truth was she hadn't seen another way. Not then. "I couldn't wait for you to figure it out," she said, her tone steady but edged with old pain. "I had to choose them over us, over you." "I know." He met her eyes, his own shadowed with something that looked like regret. And I don't blame you, not anymore." The words hung there, heavy and unfinished. Ellen wanted to ask more, about the years she'd missed, the battles he'd fought, the man he'd become. But the boys burst back in, Jack's voice loud with mock indignation. "Milo cheated! He threw it when I wasn't looking." "Did not," Milo shot back, grinning. "You're just slow." Ellen smiled despite herself, the tension easing as they slid into the booth, bringing the cold air with them. She reached out almost instinctively and ruffled Milo's hair. He ducked, but not fast enough, and Jack laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. For a moment, it was like no time had passed, like they were six again, spilling cereal on her floor, begging for one more story. Tom watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "They've missed that," he said quietly. "You being you." She pulled her hand back, folding it in her lap. "I've missed it too." The rest of the morning passed in a blur, small talk, shared glances, the boys filling the space with their energy. They drove to the edge of town after, to a field where the helicopter sat, sleek and improbable against the drab landscape. Jack begged to show her the controls, and she let him lead her inside, his hands quick and sure as he pointed out levers and gauges she didn't understand. "Dad taught us," he said, pride in his voice. "Said we should know how things work." Ellen nodded, her eyes drifting to Tom, who stood outside, hands in his pockets, watching them through the open door. She climbed out, the grass crunching under her boots, and joined him. "You've done good with them," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He shrugged, but there was a flicker of relief in his expression. "Tried to. Wasn't always easy. First year was hell, sleeping on couches, scraping by, but they kept me going." She looked back at the boys, now sprawled on the grass, arguing over who'd fly better in a real storm. "They're tough," she said, "tougher than I was." "No," Tom replied, his voice firm. "They got that from you." She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. She'd never felt tough, just desperate, cornered, doing what she had to. Maybe that was strength in its own cracked way. That afternoon, they went back to the motel. Ellen stayed longer than she'd planned, sitting on the edge of a lumpy chair while the boys sprawled on the bed, flipping through a dog-eared comic book Tom had picked up somewhere. He brewed coffee in a cheap machine, the smell filling the room, and they talked, really talked, for the first time in years. He told her about the early days after she'd kicked him out, crashing with his sister, then a friend, the boys sleeping on a pull-out couch while he worked odd jobs. He'd hit bottom in a bar one night, staring at a bottle he couldn't afford when a stranger offered him a construction gig. That job led to another, then a chance meeting with a pilot who needed a partner. Slowly, piece by piece, he'd built something. "I didn't plan it," he said, handing her a mug, "just kept moving forward, for them." Ellen sipped the coffee, bitter and strong, and studied him. The lines on his face were deeper, his hair thinner, but there was a steadiness she didn't recognize. "And you're sober?" she asked, blunt but not cruel. 6 years, he said, "not a drop since." She nodded, letting that settle. It wasn't a victory she could claim, but it mattered. It mattered more than she'd expected. The boys chimed in then, Milo recounting a time Tom had taken them camping, real camping, with a tent and a fire. Not the backyard kind they'd done as kids. Jack laughed about how Tom had burned the marshmallows, and Ellen found herself laughing too, the sound rusty but real. As the light faded, she stood to leave. The boys hugged her again, longer this time, less awkward, and Tom walked her to the door. "Tomorrow's our last day," he said, his voice low. "We've got a flight back in the evening, but we'd like to spend it with you, if you're up for it." Ellen hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. "I'll think about it," she said, and meant it. She drove home in the dusk, the sky bruising purple over the horizon. The house greeted her with its usual silence, but it felt different now, less like a cage, more like a pause. She didn't go to the twins' room this time. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, the photo from Jack in front of her, and let her mind wander. She thought of Tom's story, the struggle, the climb, the man he'd become. She thought of the boys, their resilience, their quiet forgiveness. And she thought of herself, the woman who'd closed the door 7 years ago, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She'd carried that choice like a stone, heavy and unyielding, but now it felt lighter, worn smooth by time and truth. Her phone buzzed, a text from Milo. "Hope you come tomorrow. We're making breakfast. Dad's bad at it, but we're okay." A smiley face followed, simple and unguarded. Ellen stared at it, her thumb brushing the screen. She didn't reply, not yet, but she knew she'd go. Not because they needed her or because Tom had earned it, but because she wanted to. Because 7 years was long enough to carry a ghost. That night she slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough. And when she woke, the clouds had cleared, the sky a pale, tentative blue. She pulled on her coat, grabbed her keys, and drove to the motel, the road unspooling like a thread pulling her back to them. They were waiting when she arrived, the boys bleary-eyed but grinning, Tom wrestling with a skillet on a portable stove. The room smelled of burnt toast and hope, and Ellen stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. "Need help?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Always," Tom said, and the boys laughed, pulling her into the chaos. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The motel room was a mess of mismatched plates and the sharp tang of burnt bacon when Ellen stepped in. The boys had dragged a rickety table to the center, piling it with toast, scrambled eggs, and a jug of orange juice that sloshed precariously as Jack poured. Tom stood over the stove, a towel slung over his shoulder, swearing under his breath as he scraped at a pan. It was chaos. Beautiful, ordinary chaos. And Ellen felt something shift inside her, a warmth she hadn't known she'd been missing. "Sit, Mom," Milo said, pulling out a chair with a grin. "We've got this." "Mostly," Jack added, dodging a playful swipe from his brother. She sat, her hands folding in her lap, and watched them move. Jack teasing Milo about his uneven eggs, Milo rolling his eyes but smiling. Tom caught her gaze and shrugged, a sheepish half-smile tugging at his lips. "Told you I'm no good at this," he said, sliding a plate in front of her. The eggs were lumpy, the toast charred at the edges, but it was the best meal she'd had in years. They ate together, the clatter of forks and the boys' chatter filling the small space. Ellen listened more than she spoke, soaking in their voices. Jack's quick wit, Milo's quiet observations. They told her about their lives in Seattle, the school with its sprawling campus, the friends they'd made, the time they'd convinced Tom to let them paint the garage neon green. It was a world she hadn't been part of, but it didn't feel distant anymore. It felt like a story she could step into if she chose. "You should see it," Jack said, his mouth full of toast. "The house, I mean. It's got this big window, looks out on the water. You'd like it." "Yeah," Milo chimed in softer. "There's a spot by the dock where you can sit. It's peaceful." Ellen's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Sounds nice," she said, her voice careful. She didn't know what they were asking, if it was an invitation, a hope, or just idle talk. But the idea of it, water, quiet, a place that wasn't this town, stirred something in her. Tom stayed quiet, letting the boys lead. He'd been doing that more, she noticed, stepping back, giving her space to find her footing with them. It was a kindness she hadn't expected, and it made her look at him differently, like peeling back a layer to find something solid underneath. After breakfast, they cleaned up together, the boys bickering over who'd wash and who'd dry, Ellen wiping the table with a damp cloth. Tom lingered by the stove, watching her with that same steady gaze. "What?" she asked, catching his eye. "Nothing," he said, but his smile said otherwise. "Just, you look good here, with them." She didn't reply, but the words settled into her, warm and heavy. She did feel good, not fixed, not whole, but present in a way she hadn't been in years. They spent the day together, the hours slipping by in a slow, unhurried rhythm. They walked through town, past the diner where she'd worked too many shifts, past the park where they'd sat yesterday. The boys pointed out things they remembered. The ice cream stand that used to be a gas station, the tree they'd climbed until a branch snapped. Ellen filled in the gaps, telling them about the time Jack had lost a shoe in the river or how Milo had once tried to adopt a stray cat that scratched up her couch. It was easy, almost too easy, and that scared her. She'd spent 7 years building walls, convincing herself she didn't need this, didn't need them. But now, with every laugh, every shared glance, those walls were crumbling and she wasn't sure what would be left when they fell. By afternoon, they ended up back at the field with the helicopter. The boys begged her to take a ride, and after some coaxing, she agreed. Tom climbed into the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls, and the twins strapped her in beside them. The engine roared to life, a deep thrum that vibrated through her bones, and then they were up, lifting off the ground, the world shrinking below. Ellen gripped the seat, her breath catching as the town unspooled beneath her. The diner, the river, the house on Maple Street, all of it small and fragile from this height. Jack whooped beside her, Milo's eyes wide with quiet awe, and she felt it. A rush of something wild and free, a glimpse of the life they'd lived without her. "It's amazing, right?" Jack yelled over the noise, his grin infectious. "Yeah," she shouted back, and meant it. She looked at Tom, his profile sharp against the sky, and saw the man he'd become, not the one she'd loved, not the one she'd lost, but someone new, shaped by time and choices she hadn't witnessed. They landed too soon, the ground rushing up to meet them, and Ellen's legs wobbled as she stepped out. The boys steadied her, one on each side, and she laughed, a real unguarded sound that startled her. "You okay?" Tom asked, climbing out behind them. "Better than okay," she said, and the truth of it surprised her. The day was fading when they returned to the motel. The boys sprawled on the bed, exhausted, while Tom and Ellen sat outside on a pair of plastic chairs, the air cool and still. The helicopter loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the dusk, and Ellen felt the weight of their leaving pressing in. "You're going tonight," she said, not a question. "Yeah," Tom replied, his voice low. "Got a job tomorrow, can't miss it." She nodded, staring at her hands. "And the boys?" "They'll be back in school Monday. Life keeps moving." It did. She knew that better than anyone. But this time the thought of them leaving didn't feel like an end, just a pause, a breath before the next step. "Ellen," Tom said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, "I don't know what this is, what we're doing here, but I don't want it to stop. They don't either." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man she'd once known buried under the years, the good parts, the ones she'd loved, polished by time into something stronger. "I don't either," she admitted, the words quiet but firm. He smiled, small and real. "Good, that's good." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need filling. The boys came out eventually, yawning, and hugged her. Fierce, tight hugs that left her breathless. Jack pressed something into her hand, a keychain, a tiny helicopter carved from wood. "Made it in shop class," he said, sheepish. "For you," Milo added, "so you don't forget us." "I couldn't," she said, her voice breaking, and pulled them close again. Tom drove them to the field, and she watched the helicopter lift off, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. She stood there long after it was gone, the keychain heavy in her pocket, her heart fuller than it had been in years. That night, she didn't lock the twins' room. She left the door ajar, letting the air move through, and slept with the window open, the sound of the wind like a promise. She didn't know what came next, not exactly, but for the first time in 7 years, she wanted to find out. The house on Maple Street woke to a stillness Ellen hadn't noticed before, not the heavy, suffocating kind she'd lived with for years, but a quiet that felt like possibility. She stood in the kitchen, coffee brewing, the keychain from Jack resting on the counter beside her. Its wooden edges were smooth under her thumb, a small, solid thing that tethered her to the day before, to the boys' laughter, Tom's steady gaze, the roar of the helicopter as it carried them away. She didn't feel empty this time, she felt awake. The phone rang as the coffee pot gurgled, shattering the silence. She picked it up, expecting Betty's voice nagging her back to the diner, but it was Jack. "Mom!" His voice crackled through the line, bright and a little breathless. "We made it back, just landed." Ellen smiled, leaning against the counter. "Good, you didn't crash into anything, did you?" "Not this time," he laughed. "Milo's still asleep, though, snored the whole way." "Did not," came a muffled protest in the background, and Ellen's heart lifted at the sound of them. Together, alive, hers in a way she hadn't let herself claim until now. "Tell him to wake up," she said. "I want to hear his voice, too." There was a shuffle, a groan, and then Milo's sleepy drawl. "Hey, Mom, you okay?" "Better than okay," she said, echoing her words from yesterday. "You?" "Yeah, tired but good. Dad's making us go to school tomorrow, though. Sucks." She laughed, soft and real. "You'll survive. Call me after, okay? I want to know how it goes." Promise, Jack cut in, taking the phone back. And, maybe you could come visit, like, for real? We've got a spare room. Dad said it's cool. Ellen's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the receiver. I'll think about it, she said, and this time it wasn't a dodge, it was a maybe, a door she hadn't closed. They hung up after a few more minutes, the boys' voices lingering in her ears. She poured her coffee, sat at the table, and stared out the window at the gray dawn. Seattle. A house by the water. A life she hadn't built but could step into. The idea scared her, not because it was too big, but because it felt too close, too possible. She didn't go back to the diner that day. Instead, she called Betty and quit, her voice steady as she said the words she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times. Betty sputtered, then sighed, then wished her luck in a tone that said she didn't quite believe it. Ellen didn't care. She'd spent too long pouring coffee for strangers, wiping down tables that never stayed clean. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew it wasn't that. By noon, she was in the twins' room, dust cloth in hand. She didn't clean it out, not yet, but she opened the curtains, letting light spill across the beds, the books, the toys. She ran her fingers over the spines of Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are, memories flickering like old film reels. She didn't lock the door when she left, she didn't need to anymore. That afternoon, she walked to the river, the keychain in her pocket, the air crisp against her skin. She sat on the same bench where she'd watched the boys toss the frisbee, the water rushing past in a steady, endless flow. She thought of Tom, his quiet strength, the way he'd rebuilt himself for them. She thought of Jack and Milo, their resilience, their forgiveness. And she thought of herself, the woman who'd kicked him out without looking back, who'd carried that choice like a scar. Her phone buzzed, a text from Tom. Boys told me they called. Hope that's okay. We're serious about you visiting. No pressure, just, we'd like it. A second message followed. I'd like it. She stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she stood, walked to the water's edge, and let the wind tug at her hair. She wasn't the same woman she'd been 7 years ago. Harder in some ways, softer in others, shaped by loss and survival. But she wasn't done yet. She could feel it, a pull towards something more, something real. 2 weeks later, Ellen boarded a plane. It was her first time flying, and her hands shook as she buckled the seatbelt, the hum of the engines vibrating through her. She'd sold the house on Maple Street, quickly, quietly, to a young couple who didn't ask about the locked room. She'd packed a suitcase, left the rest behind, and bought a ticket with the money she'd saved from years of double shifts. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Tom met her at the airport, the boys beside him, their faces lighting up when they saw her. They hugged her, fierce, messy hugs that left her laughing, and she felt the last of her walls give way, crumbling into dust. The drive to their house was a blur of green hills and water, the city unfolding like a promise. The house was small but warm, with a wide window overlooking the sound, just as Jack had said. They showed her the spare room, simple, with a bed and a dresser, a quilt Milo had picked out at a thrift store. She set her suitcase down, her hands steady now, and looked out at the water, silver under the late sun. That night they cooked together. Spaghetti, nothing fancy, but the kitchen filled with their voices, their laughter. Tom bumped her shoulder as he stirred the sauce, a casual touch that felt like memory, and she didn't pull away. The boys set the table, arguing over forks, and Ellen watched them, her heart full in a way she hadn't known it could be. After dinner, they sat by the dock, the air cool and damp. Jack skipped stones across the water, Milo read a book by flashlight, and Tom sat beside her, close but not too close. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the lap of waves and the boys' occasional chatter. I didn't think we'd get here, Tom said finally, his voice low. Not like this. Me neither, she replied, her eyes on the horizon, but I'm glad we did. He nodded and she felt his hand brush hers. Just a moment, a question. She didn't take it, not yet, but she didn't move away either. There was time for that, she thought, time for them all. Months passed, then a year. Ellen found work at a bookstore near the water, her days filled with the smell of paper and the soft hum of customers. She saw the boys every day, breakfast, school runs, late-night talks when they couldn't sleep. Tom was there too, a steady presence, not pushing but not fading either. They rebuilt something, not the love they'd had, but something new, fragile and strong in equal measure. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ellen stood by the dock, the keychain in her hand. She didn't need it anymore, not to remember, not to hold on. She tossed it into the water, watching it sink, and felt no loss. The boys called her inside, their voices carrying on the wind, and she turned toward them, toward the light spilling from the house. She'd kicked him out without looking back, and 7 years later, he'd returned with a truth that shattered her world. But from the pieces, she'd built something better. Not a fairy tale, not a reward, but a life. A real one. And as she walked back, the sound of her son's laughter guiding her, she knew it was enough.